Oh, dear students, I know this is where you're at right now. You're sitting on the couch, sleeping with all four legs up in the air. But please, you must stay motivated. You must stay on top of things. Welcome. And here we are talking again about our next group of ideas for the book by Malcolm Gladwell called Outliers. I want to point out here that my little plant that you saw last time has perked up and has revitalized here. That's what happens when you add a little bit of water. And sometimes, I think at this point in time where it's easy to kind of slack off a little bit and end up like my dog on the couch, you have to add a little water and then, you know, the leaves will perk up again. In any case, what I want to talk to you about are these three ideas here today, the last three concepts for the book. The first is the presumption of being heard. I also put in brackets there, savviness. The second is cultural practices. And then thirdly is the concept of the capitalization rate. The presumption of being heard is, quite simple. It's a concept that I think a lot of people find useful in researching the person that they're looking at, in the respect that usually there's a story in the person's life where a person has a kind of make or break moment. Kind of like in the book, you remember Gladwell talking about Robert Oppenheimer and having to talk his way out of poisoning his chemistry tutor. Oftentimes there are these moments where something is said or something is done that makes people believe in this individual that he or she can develop or attain something that they want. And indeed, I would suggest that if you can find that story about your person, that's the kind of gold standard that you're looking for to include in your paper. However, there's another concept of this, of the presumption of being heard, that you might also pick up on, and that is, if there's some aspect to a person's performance, if the person's an athlete or an actor or something like that, is there a particular performance that makes that person stand out? And if so, how can you document that? Well, a lot of times you can document it by finding, the language of critics or some sort of critique that has been, made about the person, particularly a movie criticism, if the person's an actor, that draws attention to, some aspect of this person. I like to think of a good example being Anthony Hopkins in The Silence of the Lambs. That was a role that pretty much cemented him as a leading man character for, until today. But prior to that, he had served on stage and on the screen for many, many, many years in small and large parts. But that particular character, where he had a certain kind of, elegance about him, and yet a certain madness to him as well, I think served him well for a lot of his roles that he played thereafter. I think it was also shortly thereafter he was named Sir Anthony Hopkins too, so it certainly helped him in that regard. That's an example of somebody who's an actor. An athlete, somebody, if you think about the particular things that would mark a great athlete like Kobe or Michael Jordan for basketball players, certain ways of playing. I think about, from my days, the way Roberto Clemente used to play baseball, with just a kind of no holds barred and a complete enthusiasm. It was electrifying to see Roberto Clemente play, when he was in his prime. In any case, those are the kinds of things that if you can talk about specific attributes of the way somebody presents themselves, then you are on the road to talking about the presumption of being heard. Something that gets that person noticed, that then helps them to perpetuate and develop their career. I say also savviness, because if you think about it in street terms, that being savvy or being smart in having street smarts to know how to work with people or know what to say to people in order to get what you want from them. Well, this is another instance of a scene or a situation that you can use from the person's life that you're talking about to illustrate this particular concept. So they're usually good stories to tell and interesting ones where people kind of grab the moment or seize the moment. Carpe diem, right? It's a carpe diem moment. So that's enough I want to say about that one. Cultural practices are a little bit harder to find and put into play. In the book, he talks about the Korean pilots, the Chinese rice farmers, that there are certain aspects of their culture that allow them to achieve and succeed. In the case of the Korean pilots, it's actually the mitigation of a certain kind of deference that allows them to be more successful pilots. These things are kind of hard to illustrate with a person's life unless you can definitely show that they exhibit a particular kind of national or ethnic or racial characteristic. Sometimes those are a little bit tricky because you're dealing with stereotypes, and I know we kind of don't always want to buy into the notion of stereotypes. So that's a little bit harder. However, also I think you can look at the family unit itself, because you're looking a lot of times at people's early lives. Are there particular cultures centered around family that might be important for why a person succeeded? Maybe there's a strong sense of being devout because the family had a strong Christian upbringing or strong religious affiliation. Maybe there's a really hardcore work ethic that's in place. These are the kinds of things that oftentimes, if you do use cultural practices, that are useful in talking about your person. So look for the culture of the family first, and if you can't, well, maybe you can find some of these ethnic or racial or national markers to illustrate the point that you're trying to make. So that's cultural practices. Finally, in the conclusion, the capitalization rate is the idea that Gladwell puts forward to talk about how, particularly in American schools, there's a lot of talent that gets left behind. He namely discusses how, we have talked about a little bit about this before, about how during summer vacation, certain students fall back because they don't have certain kinds of enrichment programs, and that the falling back continues through various different summers until the point where the person is considerably far behind other members of his or her peer group. One of the reforms Gladwell talks about, that's an institutional reform, is to amend the school year. He says that in the United States, we should go to school all year long and don't have summer vacation. But this is borne out by other countries where they do year-long schooling, and that you don't see the same kind of issues with people falling behind, and therefore losing out on the particular talents that they might have to offer to society. And of course, a lot of that is borne out by the way people are brought about, raised, and schooled. In the conclusion, what I'm suggesting is, after you've looked at the person that you are researching, see if there's some aspect of their life that you could institutionalize or make a part of some sort of school effort or create some other sort of institution that might help others to become successful in the way that your successful person has become. So, I gave the example in my write-up of soccer players. It seems like in America we can never quite make the same level of soccer player as elsewhere. This is a good example. We have a really, different way of going about this, bringing players up through the college ranks. In most other countries, these young soccer players are targeted and raised, if you will, on special schools where elite players are involved, and they're associated with the club teams. And these club teams, of course, have a lot of money to spend on training, and it's probably not a surprise then that the greatest players in the world come from parts of the world where these club teams can take and train people at a very early age. Messi, who's a particularly strong topic for this paper. A lot of people like to write about Messi. He's a good example, right, of how he left Argentina early on and went to Spain to train with Barcelona, and he was trained to be a number 10 on the field his entire life. And so it's no surprise then he has gone to be one of the greatest players of his generation. You probably think about this in other ways for other kinds of people in sports. How do we make sports stars? Well, they come up through the college ranks. Maybe there's a better way to do it. Maybe we should make basketball players the same way that Europe makes soccer players. How do we become actors? How do we become musicians? How do we become scientists? Are there better ways to do it than to go through school for an extended period of time? These are the kinds of things that I'm asking you to think about and look at. And then, of course, to provide some sort of warrant for your idea of how to change an institution or make an institution, I'm suggesting that you give a rationalization as to why your institution might help people reach the goals better or faster. Or perhaps look at where that institution does exist in a different part of the world and look at that as evidence that a different approach or different institutionalization of making doctors, engineers, scientists, actors, musicians might be in order. So those are the three concepts I really kind of want to talk about today. I know next week is our spring break week. I would strongly urge you to use it to research your paper. I'm probably going to make either one or two videos just to kind of urge you along with a project that I'm researching, and then I will tell you about that at that point in time. But it'll go along the same lines of what you're doing. I'm reading about a particular individual, and then I'm trying to apply the concepts of Gladwell book towards that person's life. So I'll either do one or two videos of that next week, even though it's spring vacation. Mainly because I know it's real easy to fall into a slump, and 1 week off can mean you get into a groove that you can't get out of. And I don't want you ending up like that plant over there last week, right, where your leaves are wilting. All you have to do is add a little bit of water, and it comes right back and is fighting mad the next week. So in any case, there's that. I'm coming at you, and then when we come back, I will be talking about a couple of papers that I think have been successful, so you can see model papers along these lines, and we'll talk about the strengths and weaknesses of those. And then we'll be into Kundera's identity in the week after that. So next week, spring break, don't use that as vacation. Don't slough off. It'll be too hard to get out of it afterwards if you do. Use it to your advantage, especially because you can't really go anywhere right now. And then, after that, we'll be talking about rough drafts. Again, it goes without saying, you can send me your rough draft and have me look over it and comment on it. Any number of rough drafts. Sometimes this is a good paper to turn in 2, 3, 4. Certainly students have done that before if they can stay motivated. I encourage you to do that. And then after that, the final draft will be due on the 15th of April, and then we're into our final book, Kundera's Identity. So that's it for right now. I encourage you to, this one ran a little bit longer than I had anticipated just because I had these 3 different concepts to cover. But stay vigilant, be well, and we'll see you next week talking about one of my own little projects. Take care.